Hi there, my name is Alex Latch and what you're about to see is my F1 final major project from my last year in college. Now, I've been tasked with creating a media product with the theme of Back to the Future, showcasing a digital art charity event. The event is to take something old and modernise it, or make something modern, like a futuristic version of it, to then show your skills forward and prove what things from the past could look like if they were built now, or if something was built now would look like in 100 years' time or so. So I came up with two ideas and put them into separate mood boards. This was my first idea, which was to create a Jekyll and Hyde, because since the book's actually come out, there hasn't been I guess you call it a accurate rendition of it in like a TV show format. There's been a couple of TV shows, last one being in the early 2010s, but like they have never followed the book properly, or the story. They've taken their own liberties with it and adjusted it slightly here and there. For like the TV one, the latest one was like they followed Jekyll's great grandson instead of actually him. So my idea consisted of creating a 3D environment and walking through it, whether that be by an animation or putting it into Unity. I never quite worked out the final idea on that, but it would be like to create the iconic street where Hyde's door is and where the opening of the story takes place. And I was thinking of having like an audio book go over it to help explain the scene, so it would give a bit more context to it. I like that. I like the idea, but I just couldn't see myself being able to stick with it, and I could keep thinking of a few issues that I'd quite struggled to finish. But my second idea was for an F1. The original piece was 90 years of Ferrari, because Ferrari is the only team in the sport that has been there since it was created in 1950. So my idea for this was to create 4 F1 cars, 3 from current that have been in the past up on here, the 1950, 80 and the 2010, and then to create my own future version of it, so like my own spin on what it could look like in the year 2050, which is what I decided on. But, so I had a couple of pictures on my mood boards with different ideas and plannings, and these are future art concepts people have created, including one that Ferrari themselves made. But after looking through this and getting some feedback, I came to the realization that doing 4 cars in the time we had would be unrealistic, so I wanted to make them really high detailed and photorealistic. So in order to actually be able to get the workload done, I brought it back down to just doing 2 cars, one being the 1950 and being my own idea, which I have set in the year 2050, so doing a 100-year leap into the future from the original from the first ever F1 car was made. Yeah, so that's some of my aims. So my aim was to make 2 cars and have them really well textured, so that you find it hard to tell if it was real life or a picture, and to just make them in a scene that looked quite nice, and make them. The main goal was to make 2 cars so well done and really high textured and polished that you struggle you look at it and have to really question yourself: is that real? And that was the main goal with my my aims. For my primary research, there's going to be quite a few slides here, because I was able to go to the National Motoring Museum located in Bewley, just outside the New Forest, that had a bunch of classic F1 cars ranging from 1950 all the way to their latest one was 2012. So I was able to go there and talk to some of the historians there and learn more about the cars and gain some facts and how they've changed from the original to what they are now and going forward with it. So I apologise, I'm going to be going for a while. So this was the 1950 car. This was a 1950 BRM, or British Racing Motors. This was really important for my research, because this was a car from the year that I was modelling the Ferrari from. Even though they didn't have one, most of the specs is still the same because of the rules they have to follow. But this was quite helpful. So like you can see on this information board here that it actually it was a front-motored car with rear-wheel drive with a V16 engine in it. So you can imagine it was very loud. And I had a few pictures, like it was the general shape of the car, and I saw from pictures I found online, I they were most of them were black and white, so I couldn't get a good accurate of what the car looked like. But I could see on here that the 1950s actually had vents going all the way on the front body where you could flip out and see the engine to help get air into it and let some exhaust come out from the side parts of it as well. I was also able to get a good view of the grille and the suspension icons and see that it was 3 main pieces going from the wheel into the chassis, and the other helpful bit was being able to see the cockpit. So I wanted to make it accurate, so I needed to do like an inside-ish view of it. So I was able to see like it's a simply worn leather seat with a simple steering wheel with 3 centerpieces and a little hole in the middle. By looking at the Ferrari one, they've put that hole in the middle with a little a badge of the Ferrari logo, so to make it more on brand and everything. And just looking at this, and like you can read more of it in detail on my blog, was quite helpful, showing the basics of the car and what they were like. And then the next one is from the famous 1967 Lotus. So you can see here from just a gap of 17 years, it's a big difference. It's now running a V8 engine that is actually in the back of the car and open for, not covered at all, so it was completely open at that time. And this car was, I forgot to mention the tyres. Like, the tyres was also quite helpful to see on the 1950 car, because you can see in all the pictures, like they were grooved tyres. They had a bunch of metal going in between it, so like for the rim of it, so which is very different compared to what the tyres are now. But the 67 is a very famous car that was so good on debut. The creators of Lotus didn't change it for another 3 years because it was so dominant from when it first came out. And you can just see the general shape of the car. It's gone from quite big and boxy to very low to the ground and more aerodynamic by having it more longer and more streamlined, as well as having the air intake valve at the front, which is, or the, I guess you could call it the front of the car. The next car they had there was a 1994 Mclaren, and you can see from here like it's a big difference from the original too, and that was this kind of the direction F1 went with for a while. So I was very lucky with this one that the people running the museum, I've forgotten the name of them, actually let me go behind the line and go and stand next to the car and look at it in much more detail, which is where I got the seat and the suspension pictures from, because you can see from the suspension that they get a lot more complicated in this era, as well as the cars now having rear wings and front wings for that matter, to help them be more aerodynamic, help them get winds and scoop them up and go further in the car. So it actually increases the speed and the downforce, so there's much more stronger stick to the road, and so overall thicker, faster, not thicker, and just more streamlined. Like I've got this side picture here showing you the general shape of the car, as well as the front picture here showing just getting the general shape, and you can see that the car from the front wing starts off very thin where the wing is and how it builds up, and then becomes more boxy and wider as you get to the cockpit, and then the rear of the car where you've got the engine and the exhaust located. You can also see slightly on this picture here, it's a bit hard to see, but in 1994 they introduced fueling into the sport, so cars would have to stop midway through a race, refuel with fuel and go out. It was also quite interesting in 1994, prior to this you could have traction control, active suspension and a bunch of other driver aids, and they removed that from the sport for this year to make it a much more physical sport. So it was less what computers could do and more what the driver could do to make it more entertaining and show which was better, who was the better driver, not who had the smartest car. The next car they had was a 1996 Williams, which is a title-winning car, which is the only other title-winning car other than the old Lotus they had on display. This was Williams, which is British engineering, and you can just see in a span of 2 years from the 96 car how wide and different the cars have changed for. Because going at the 94 there, it's all quite narrow. It's narrow compared to the 97, where it's got a much wider wheelbase, so there's much more room from the wheels to where the actual suspension goes into the car. And it was much more streamlined, I believe these had a V10 engines in them, going from the V8s of the old era back to much more powerful, more roaring engines. This refueling was still a thing from the 94 season with this, and this was a title-winning car that dominated Williams with their technical know-how and skill, dominated the entire decade of the 1990s, winning 4 Drivers' Championships and 5 Constructors, which is the general team score. So this was one of the most dominant cars of its time, was the 1960, or 1960 I should say. And curiously, they also had a 1996 Ferrari which was driven by Michael Schumacher, and you can just see from these pictures how, even though these cars were from the same year, how different the design was. Because the Ferrari here, as you can see, is a much more boxy, more fixed nose, thicker nose car when comparing it to the Williams. So you can just see even from these pictures, without going into too much detail, is how every team can have their own different twist on what the regulations can be and how they can differ the car. Because of this choice, it was very uncompetitive and was a struggle to finish a race with. But when conditions are right, like in the wet, like an iconic scene of Michael Schumacher winning in this car in Spain, when the conditions came right, even a car that looks strange compared to what the fastest one is, can pull through a miracle and win drastically. The next car that has a big leap was the 2006 McLaren. I believe this might actually be a 2007, I'm not too sure, but you can see here from going from 1996 to the 2006, so 10 years, again, the cars have changed drastically. They're much smaller now, and they have rims, tyres, and much more sophisticated aerodynamics on the actual body, with more lines sweeping through and holes to let air be sucked in towards the engine. These was going back to, they had V10s for a very long time in the late 90s and early 2000s, but from 2006 to 2014 they went to, or 13 I should say, they went back to V8 engines for sustainability and reliability than to be more economically friendly. So this car wasn't the best because it had some reliability issues, but from this design, McLaren were able to make for the next 2 years a title contending car and battling it out constantly with Ferrari towards the end. So this car, even like that 96 Ferrari, even though they weren't great to begin with, they became much better cars because from learning from their mistakes from the past here. And the final car they had was a 2012 Lotus Renault, which was a Renault works team that they paid to have the name Lotus. And this car, you can see here, even from 2006, a 6-year difference, you can see how much the car's changed from being a small, wide, almost box type shape to being a much more thin and streamlined shape. You can see on the back here how they've built it for the air almost as slim to slide down the shape of the chassis towards the rear wing and the diffusers at the back. So this car was driven by Kimi Raikkonen, who was a world champion for Ferrari in the past, and just showing here, even just a 6-year time gap, the cars can change so much that you never quite know what's going to be in the future, but you can build a rough idea of what's going to happen. I also had these pictures of some steering wheels showing how different something as simple as a steering wheel can be as time goes on. Now that was my primary research. Mainly I just went there and learned more about the cars and talked to historians there and more information. For my secondary research, these were these 5 videos and this link were the main sources of my research. So in order from top left going right is the order of which video link this is to that. So the first one was a video made by the official F1 YouTube channel going over the origins and the history of Ferrari. So I was able to learn in even more depth how big Ferrari is in Italy and how important it is to get things right historically, because they are very passionate about their work. And the second one was a nice small video just showing what the cars look like on the side, with a bit of information on every single year from 1950 to 2019. And the other videos go on a bit more about like the history and the pedigree, and as well as the safety innovations. And this last video here is a video going over concept F1 cars, ranging from ones that teams actually made, so that actual F1 cars that you could go to like a museum and see, as well as just ones that fans of the sport have made on using 3D software, and like that one there's a 3D software created car, and then just giving an idea of what they think the cars could look like in the future, and just what fans generally think the sport, which way the sport may go. And a lot of them had Aero Screens on them, so becoming enclosed cockpit. And looking at that and adding to my research, it made me realise that even if I personally don't like that idea, it's probably more realistically going to be the way the sport goes, and I need to consider that in my own design. Now, practical skills. So making my car, I was using a few different softwares, including learning a completely new software from scratch. Oh, that's a typo, I apologise for that. So the main softwares I used was 3ds Max for the 3D modelling aspects. So I modelled all the cars in 3ds Max and got them in general shape. The software I mentioned was Adobe Substance Painter. I'd never used Substance Painter before, but my lecturer installed it on my college computer, and he was able to teach me some basics, and I learned the rest on my own of how making the textures and painting the cars in Substance made them look so much better than if I was just to try and create a material in 3ds Max. I was able to use that to my advantage to really make the cars more realistic and reach my aims. And the other software I used was Photoshop and GIMP for making concept drawings. I used that for my drawings of making my own concept of the car and pushing that forward, so I could get a nice thing to go from, rather than trying to create it blind with no idea of what I was drawing or modelling. Once that was done, it was time for the actual production of the project. So I started with making a simple block out. You can see on this picture here, of what kind of size and height I wanted the car to be. I had the idea that if I had enough time, I would create a scene of the Monza Autodrome, which is Ferrari's home race. But I didn't get to that because I ran into some issues along the way that put me back about a week or two behind my schedule. So I had to scrap the idea of creating a Monza scene in order to make sure I could get the cars in the best way possible. Now, I'm going to briefly go over, I've taken a couple of slides to show you the process of me making the car. So starting with the top left going to the bottom right is the process I used. So I started by I managed to find some blueprints of the 1950 Ferrari, and I put them into 3ds Max on planes, as you can see here, and I used them to model around and use them to make sure I was getting the width, the length, the size of the car accurate. So I started by just putting a couple planes into and using bitmap to make them fit properly in the scene. Then I started using a simple box and turning it into inevitable poly and just simply modelling it forward. And you can see here as time went on, got more and more close to the actual finished product. And I then, because I was only modelling half the car, because I was planning to use symmetry so I could half my workload and still get an accurate recreation of the car. So you can see down here, I've only got half the car there. That's because by using the tool symmetry, it basically almost reflects like a mirror the other side of the car, and so I could half the workload per car, but still get a finished product if I did all of it. You can see here I was planning to do that for everything. So here I created a small exhaust by simply taking a cylinder and stretching it out to the length of the car as it is on the blueprints, as well as a fuel intake cap and a air filter and a few other things. And then once I'd gotten a rough shape of the car, I then went to work on creating the tyre. As seen in the photo from the BRM, I knew that it had this small little piece of metal for the suspension to go into, and it was shown with just the cap of the tyre. And then from there, I was able to extend something and put on a open subdiv to smooth out the size of the tyre, or the rim of the tyre, and then added these little pieces of these little cylinders that I would turn into metal, and just put them around to make the correct shape of the car. And I then, on top of that, made another cylinder, put an open subdiv on that, and to make the actual rubber part of the tyre that would go on the road. All the colours here is from when I unwrapped it, and I put a seam down the side of it so it would unwrap and unfold properly for texturing later on. And all that colour shows is that it was that there's no oversight, nothing was touching, and it made a smooth process because of it. And then from there, I added, once the sides were done, I exported it into my car scene. You can see there that was what the car looked like at that time. And then went on to work on because I had a rough shape of what the car looked like, and then went on to work with the finer details to make it accurate. So I created a interior cockpit. So here was just with the shape of the car with a few dots from where I would put things like speedometer, rev counter, fuel gauge, and so on. And then I started working on the seats, which I took a cylinder and made an integral poly, and then shaped it round using the picture of the BRM as a good reference point to make it into a shape that would fit into the cockpit without disturbing anything. And I was also able to use, you can see just in the corner here, the blueprints had a top view, so I was able to make sure the seats was in the right shape with the car and not out of the way. I then went on to work making the steering wheel, and as mentioned with the BRM, like the Ferrari had a little badge in the centre here, so that's what that dome shape was. And I then put that all into the same scene as the car, and then started attaching everything together in target welding vectors to make sure there was all the right shape and there was nothing missing out in the process. I realised at the end that I missed two key points of this, and this is what put me back, is I had forgotten to create suspension for the car, so the wheels were just basically sitting next to it. So I quickly created some cylinders and connected them to put on the car and attach them correctly so the car had wheels on it and something supporting it. And I also realised as I was about to put it into substance paint that I forgot to make the grille on the front of the car. So I quickly put that back in a 3ds Max and made a simple cross-section grille with a couple of cylinders, and attached it to the body correctly. And I separated my UVW unwraps that I did into 3 separate parts. I made one for the wheel, one for the main car body that was going to be painted red, and then I made an extras, which was what the suspension, the air filter, the fuel cap, the exhaust all went onto, so I could paint them a different colour to the car and make sure they came out properly. And once that was done, I then started working on my future car concepts. Now I took a lot of inspiration from the video I showed earlier, as well as just doing my own research on things like ArtStation, and ArtStation was a big one, and a few other F1 websites, so like sporting, like things like Motorsports, the official F1 website, BBC Sports, where people had posted where they covered concepts of possible rule changes in the past, and I looked at some of them, and these two you see here are made by the same person, who I can't pronounce their name, and I apologise to them. It's I can't see my picture, I apologise. But these are two. This was a concept he did for a 2014 regulation change, and this is something he did for the 2022 regulation change, which none of these cars were made, but I liked the idea of how he modelled them, and I took some inspiration from them when it came to creating my own car, which is this drawing here. So I took some of these to use as reference, as well as a few other pictures. These were the two main inspirations, and I was able to use them with influence. So for example, I took the chassis side and shape of having that dagger point there from the old Mclaren drawing, which is that concept. And also, because the brand new regulations just came in, introducing something called ground effects to them. They have these massive side pods on the cars at the moment, which, considering these regulations just came in, I imagine they'd be sticking around for a while, because they're very innovative and also very safe for the drivers. So I had the idea from looking at the Ferrari picture of creating some side pods, but having a smaller one underneath the main one, so an extra air intake for more support and just to take more air into the car, make it stick to the road more. I also, as you can see, added a Aero Screen. As by looking at the ideas, I realised even if I don't like that idea, it's most likely going to be the reality that sooner or later the car has to have one. So I made a design that would fit an Aero Screen, as well as adding an old something from previous cars called a shark fin, which helps the air split onto the rear wings on the rear wing and improve downforce, and it also just looks really cool. Once I had drawn my car concept, it was then time to make it. So that's when the modelling process started, and at the beginning it's the exact same as the 1950 car. I got put a plane with a bitmap on it to put my drawing on, and then just started building from the side with a symmetry. Always pausing to double check to make sure I was getting the proportions right, which I struggled with at the beginning because I couldn't quite figure out. Because I'd drawn, if I go back, I'd drawn these separate lines to show different parts of the chassis and like how they'd gone out a bit. So at the beginning I quite struggled with getting that bit right, but I was able to, with having symmetry on and putting on two different viewports, I was able to see the shape and what I needed, and was then able to work forward and making that into reality. And you can see on this picture at the bottom here, I'd gotten to a point where I created the basic shape of the car and then went into more detail, so I was able to create a slightly wider shape for the side pod, and then able to take the polygons and delete them from the scene to make that opening for the air to go into for the car. I've also forgot to mention that I created this little thing here, which is similar to a barge board, which first came into F1 in 1994 with the Mclaren. And there's just more of a way to help channel the air through and help them work with the car, with the aerodynamics. So I thought of, even though they've gotten rid of them this year, I thought I could bring back a much simpler version one just to help channel the air into the side pods and give them more effect. And so once I'd gotten that done, that was quite difficult, making sure that stuck to the car, but also having a big gap so in them without it with it still being able to be modelled. So I had to build that out and then delete the inside of it and then bridge every single vertex inside to make sure that it was its own proper object and could work in when rendering it out, so you'd actually be able to see the inside and outside of the barge board. And then from there I started a basic work on the front wing. You can see a bit better on that picture. The front wing I struggled with quite a lot, because it was, in order to get the shape that I wanted of basically the main nose of it going down and then coming out and then upwards for more the air, so it could go onto it and slope out to the side into going towards the side pods. It was really difficult. I wanted to have some like cuts in between, so like every other polygon I would delete it so that the air would flow through in theory. But I couldn't get the object to work with that idea, so I decided to compromise and have a more of a sloping wing, so the air would flow through it or over, I should say, for the effect I wanted. I just couldn't get the actual effect the original idea, and compromised by adjusting it slightly. Once that was done, I then started working on the rear wing, which is here, and I realised that I'd made a problem with my design at this stage, that I had focused so much on the body and what size I wanted the wheels to be, because that's a big factor to it as well. I hadn't actually thought of a way to connect the rear wing to the car, where I had but I then managed to have the idea that I built, you can see on this one, these little vanes and fins at the end of the car, and I realised that I could use that to my advantage and have that as being like a holster for the rear wing to attach to. So it'd also be much more stable, because that's one thing, that if a car hits the rear wing in current F1, it's most likely going to fly off and take you out of the race, because they're not attached to the main chassis. But by adding this, I was able to increase the stability of the wing. I was also hopefully being able to make cars race a bit more closer and a bit harder without risking having to destroy their car or their opponents. Once I'd done that, I then started going onto the Aero Screen, which, like everything else, including the wing, I symmetried it, so I only did half of it, and I'd realised that I'd wanted it to go all the way to the top, but I'd forgotten that cars needed to have the main air intake just above where the driver sits. So I adjusted the Aero Screen and had it go a little bit lower down than the top, but also wider. Because the idea would be, I'm sure, it's a question of, if you've got a screen like that, how do the drivers get in and out? But the plan would be to, by extending it a bit further, instead of, the original one was supposed to end about here on this vertex line there, just where the cockpit ends. But I extended it so that by making it longer, I could, if this were to be made into an actual car, teams could implement almost like with jet fighters, so that the screen could slide forward for the drivers to be able to get in and out of. So that was a problem that I managed to find a quite smart solution to help increase the design and make it a more realistic approach. And once that was roughly done, I then went to work on the new wheel, where I was able to use one of my older saves of the 1950 wheel before I'd created all the I'm going to call them metal pipes, the inside bit. I was able to take an older save of that before I made the pipes, and was able to work from that to create a wheel cover, which is something that F1 has introduced this year for the first time ever, to make the cars a bit safer. So I was able to create a wheel cover, as well as being able to model in the actual wheel nut that the tyres need to be attached on and off the car, obviously. And I was then able to unwrap it and then export it into the car model to then be attached to the car. And you can see here, this was the final turnout what the model looked like, with the suspension attached to it and all the symmetry done. And then from there, see these small pictures here, I then put it into Substance Painter. I was able to create a nice metal paint job and get the official Ferrari colour code, which I believe is D4000, and I was able to make that and model it, as well as adding, on the same as the 1950s, some stickers and badges to the car. I wanted to create more special and futuristic ones. I have something like a Shell logo or a few other things, but I decided, after consulting with my brother and a few other people, that would not be a smart idea due to copyright reasoning. I didn't want to risk getting my work copyrighted or have any legal issues by using someone's logo without their consent. And I also, after finishing it, realised that the rear wing, so I put a carbon fibre texture on it, looked a bit dull, didn't have anything really, it just looked like a piece of black metal. So from that I had the idea of what they did with their old 2010 cars, of painting the Italian flag on the back of it to give a bit more colour and more vibrant, and it also worked quite well with the carbon fibre texture to it. And I'm going to show you the final renders now. I'm very proud of what they look like, and I ran into a few issues that I've covered with each of them, but I was able to make them work and adjust them forward. So this is the 3 renders of the 1950 car. That's the main side. I actually see the badge and the metal work came out quite well there, as well as being able to create the interior cockpit. I was quite pleased with how the badge came out. I was struggling with getting that on such a small object in a Substance Painter. And then you can see the grill and the air intake working with the tyres. I managed to find a tyre substance and able to attach that to it to give it a proper ridges inside the tyre that they had in the time. And then finally, here are the renders of my future Ferrari that I've made. And just to round it up, overall, I'm really happy with the results of this project. I'm quite proud of how I managed to make the cars look realistic, especially the old one from an actual picture that I saw of it from a auction website. There are a few things I could change, however. I would have liked to be able to spend a bit more time on my future car, because the back end of the car, as you can see, is that there isn't anything there. The body just stops, so there's no like exhaust for it, or just like a diffuser, which most cars have. So if I had more time on this project, I would have added a bit more to that, added a few more things just to make it more realistic and just make the car seem more what it actually has. But other than that, I'm really happy with with what I've managed to do, and I've hoped you've enjoyed it too. So thank you very much for listening to me. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.